The authorities in Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party are fantasizing about relying on the U.S. to seek independence and resisting unification with force. This is a serious misjudgment of the situation, public opinion, and military strength. It's reckless and extremely dangerous. I solemnly warn the DPP authorities. Are you like a mantis trying to stop a chariot? You will only bring your own destruction.
This harsh rhetoric came a few days ago from China's Ministry of Defense. Surprisingly, the Chinese Foreign Ministry followed suit, also directing aggressive comments toward the U.S., but this time they made a big mistake by targeting the wrong audience. On March 4th, President Trump raised tariffs on Chinese goods by an additional 10%, making the total tariff 20%. In response, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian stated that if the U.S. had other motives and insisted on starting a tariff or trade war, China would fight back to the end. China then introduced retaliatory measures, including new tariffs on certain U.S. agricultural products and food, ranging from 10 to 15%. They also imposed export and investment restrictions on 25 U.S. companies, citing national security concerns. The U.S. responded quickly. On March 5th, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth appeared on Fox News and addressed China's claim of being ready for any kind of war. He emphasized that the U.S. did not seek war with China, but was preparing its military for the future to ensure peace through strength. Those who long for peace must prepare for war. That's why we're rebuilding our military. That's why we're reestablishing deterrence in the warrior ethos. We live in a dangerous world with powerful ascendant countries with very different ideology. On March 6th, during a routine press conference, a reporter asked the Chinese Foreign Ministry about Hegseth's comments. Lin Jian, who had earlier said China was ready to fight back to the end, quickly changed his tone. He accused U.S. officials for intentionally provoking an ideological confrontation by exaggerating the threat from China. Lin reiterated that China's position remained consistent. Whether it's a trade war, Cold War, or hot war, China believes such conflicts cannot be won and should not be fought. Experts noticed how quickly the Chinese Foreign Ministry shifted its stance. This suggests a growing rift between China's diplomatic and military leadership. The military is aware that China's actual military strength is nowhere near as strong as it claims, especially compared to the U.S. If a real war broke out, the Chinese military would be quickly defeated, and the Chinese government would collapse. Today, we're going to take a quick look at the real comparison between the military forces of the U.S. and China, focusing on air power, since the Taiwan Strait is a likely conflict zone where air forces would play a critical role. First, let's talk about stealth aircraft. In modern air combat, stealth fighters are the key to dominance. The U.S. has been a leader in this field. In 1983, the U.S. introduced the world's first stealth bomber, the F-117 Nighthawk, which had a radar cross-section the size of a small wash basin, just 0.1 square meters. In 2005, the U.S. launched the F-22 Raptor, which was even more advanced. Its radar cross-section was only the size of a fingernail. By 2007, the U.S. retired the F-117 Nighthawk after a mishap in the Yugoslav War, where it was shot down by a missile. But by then, the F-22 was already in service. In 2015, the U.S. introduced the F-35 Lightning II, a more affordable version of the F-22 with a radar cross-section the size of a tennis ball. Recently, the F-117 Nighthawk was brought out of retirement for missions in the Middle East because the U.S. realized that Chinese and Russian radar systems just couldn't detect stealth aircraft as well as previously thought. In fact, Russia's S-400 missile system, which was believed to be capable of countering stealth aircraft, couldn't detect these advanced planes. And China's J-20 stealth fighter is also less effective than the F-117 in this regard. The U.S. is confident that even if a plane like the F-117 crashes, as one did in Syria, it's not a big loss since newer aircraft like the F-22 and F-35 are far more advanced. Now let's talk about the F-15, an excellent U.S. fighter that has been around since the 1970s. It doesn't have stealth capabilities, and it was supposed to be retired over 20 years ago, but recently the U.S. has introduced an upgraded version, the F-15EX. This version still doesn't have stealth, but it has advanced electronics like the F-35, and its payload has increased from 7 tons to 13 tons. Surprisingly, it costs more than the F-35. This shows that the US military has assessed that China and Russia's radar and missile systems are not a significant threat to an aircraft like the F-15, which lacks stealth capabilities. In fact, Chinese military officials have admitted that their weapons are not as advanced as Russia's, and their reliability is even worse. Western experts have also concluded that China's radar systems are at least 10 years behind Russia's. China's purchase of Russia's S-400 missile system is an example of this. Even Russia's advanced anti-aircraft missiles deployed in Syria were reportedly destroyed by Israel's F-35 fighters, which were never shot down. Given all this, could we say that the F-35, with its radar cross-section only 1/10 of the F-117 and the F-22, and with just 1% of the F-117's radar reflection, could fly freely over China's capital, Beijing? In reality, the F-35 and F-22 have repeatedly entered China's airspace without being detected. China's military is either unaware of this or too afraid to admit it. In fact, according to publicly available U.S. military data, one way to neutralize China's intercontinental nuclear missiles in the northwest region is for the F-35 to shoot them down during the ascent phase. When it comes to intercontinental missiles, it only takes about 3 or 4 minutes for them to launch and exit the atmosphere. However, the F-35 flying from a U.S. base in Japan to China's northwest would take about 2 to 3 hours. This means that the U.S. couldn't wait until China's missiles are launched to send the F-35 into Chinese airspace. Military experts in China speculate that, based on U.S. intelligence, the U.S. likely keeps several F-35s constantly flying over China's northwest, rotating them every few hours, in case a Chinese missile launch is detected. This suggests that the U.S. has full access to China's airspace, and the F can enter it freely. This reinforces the idea that the U.S. military, with its advanced technology, can operate in China's airspace with ease, while China's most advanced fighter jet, the J-20, struggles. The J-20 made headlines during its first mission at the China-India border, only to be detected by Indian radar right away. Experts believe this was due to the J-20's duck-wing design, which caused a fatal radar signature that allowed Indian radars to pick it up. In the U.S. military, there's a running joke: the best place to install a duck-wing is on an enemy's aircraft, and the J-20's got one. The J-20 was forced to adopt the duck-wing design because when China tried to copy the U.S. F-22, they found their internal avionics and engine were much larger and heavier than the F-22's, causing the aircraft's aerodynamics to deform. As a result, they had to add the duck-wing to maintain its flying performance. Next, China's J-35, which is intended to rival the U.S. F-35, is facing problems. Due to insufficient engine thrust, the J-35 couldn't mimic the single-engine design of the F-35, and so ended up using a twin-engine setup. This awkward design doesn't improve performance over the J-20, nor does it lower production costs. It's become another example of China's military inefficiency. Now let's compare the air-to-air missiles on these aircraft. The U.S. has recently equipped its fighters with the AIM-260 air-to-air missile, which has a range of 180 kilometers. Meanwhile, China claims its PL-15 missile can reach 300 kilometers. So what's going on here? Let's break it down. Most countries' air-to-air missiles work in similar ways. The rocket fuel burns out halfway through the missile's range. For example, when targeting an enemy at 8,000 meters altitude, the missile will climb to over 10,000 meters during its powered phase. Once it gets closer to the target, it dives down to attack. This happens because, at higher altitudes, there's less air resistance, and diving helps convert altitude into speed. However, as the missile reaches the final third of its range, the lack of fuel means the missile starts to slow down due to air resistance. This makes it much easier for the enemy to evade the missile through high-speed maneuvers. The missile's speed decreases, and when it tries to follow sharp turns, it loses even more energy. So the missile only remains a real threat to larger, slower targets, like early warning or transport aircraft, in the last stage of its range. This principle applies to all current air-to-air missiles in active service worldwide. Based on the typical over-the-top claims from China and Russia, we can make some educated guesses about how China's PL-15 missile supposedly achieves its claimed 300-kilometer range. 1. The missile is fired from an extremely high altitude, and the target is also at a high altitude, which minimizes air resistance. 2. The target is massive and does not maneuver at all. 3. The target even deliberately emits radar signals to guide the missile toward it. This type of cheating is a common practice during testing at Chinese research institutes, especially when military leaders are inspecting the results. China's fighter jet radars, for example, have limited ability to detect and track enemy aircraft at distances over 200 kilometers. Real analysis shows that the radar is almost blind beyond that range, and China's missile radars are even less capable than those on U.S. missiles. So, if the PL-15 can reach 200 kilometers, if the enemy aircraft doesn't move, the missile may still not detect it. In testing, the target aircraft has to emit a strong radar signal, like a blazing fire in the dark, so that the half-blind PL-15 can detect it. If the PL-15 hits a target at 200 kilometers under these conditions, the Research Institute will claim a 300-kilometer range on the report. Experts who've been briefed beforehand will sign off, and inflated design parameters, sometimes 50% higher than real-world performance, are a must. This ensures that all the involved parties, from the military to the design institutes to logistics procurement, benefit financially. So, when China claims that the PL-15 has a 300-kilometer range, it likely means 1. It poses no real threat to the U.S. F-35s, F-22s, or even the retired F-117. 2. It could pose a limited threat at 50 to 60 kilometers to fourth-generation fighters like the Su-37 or F-16. If they don't use countermeasures. 3. It might be a threat to large, slow-moving, less maneuverable targets like early warning aircraft at 80 to 100 kilometers, if they don't use countermeasures. 4. At ranges beyond 130 to 150 kilometers, targets are essentially safe. Now, let's compare this with the U.S. AIM-260 missile. The U.S. is ahead in rocket technology, and their missiles are generally smaller and more efficient. With the same range, the AIM-260 is much smaller than the Chinese or Russian missiles. During the first half of its flight, the AIM-260 works similarly to the PL-15. It accelerates and climbs using rocket fuel before cutting off and relying on inertia. However, once it nears the target and begins its dive, the missile reignites the rocket. So, even if the enemy tries to make high-speed, high-G maneuvers, the AIM-260 can still catch up. The AIM-260 uses both radar and infrared guidance systems. Even with just one of these, it's far more capable than the PL-15 in terms of detection range and target recognition. Using both together makes it even more powerful, boosting its ability to detect and track targets by several times. So, once the AIM-260 locks onto a target, it's essentially guaranteed to hit. The U.S. also takes a conservative approach when testing missile performance. If the AIM-260 has a 300-kilometer range at high altitudes and 250 kilometers at low altitudes, the official range is listed at 250 kilometers. In testing, the target is usually as small as a fighter jet, and sometimes even has stealth capabilities and performs evasive maneuvers. If the missile can consistently hit targets under these conditions, then the U.S. will accept the range as accurate. However, even with the 250-kilometer range of the AIM-260 missile, the figures released by the U.S. are likely not the actual data, but a classified version. The publicly disclosed range would be likely at a reduced value, meaning the true range could be closer to 180 kilometers. In practical combat scenarios, this could mean that Chinese aircraft, including the J-20, could inexplicably explode in midair at distances of 250 kilometers, without even knowing where the American aircraft are. That's why, when confronting China's PL-15, the U.S. can confidently assert that AIM-260 is a true weapon of future sky supremacy. China's active-duty military boasts a force of approximately 2.3 million soldiers, which is larger than the U.S. Army. However, in terms of weaponry and combat effectiveness, China's forces still lag significantly behind the U.S. military. The essential point is that the U.S. has no intention to invade China, and the Chinese military does not possess the capability to project power overseas and pose a direct threat to the U.S. In any potential Taiwan conflict, the Chinese Marine Corps would play a key role. However, currently, China's Marine Corps consists of only 6 brigades, which are stationed in different locations. Even if all these brigades were concentrated on one area to launch an assault on Taiwan, it still wouldn't be enough for a full-scale operation. Recognizing this shortcoming, China has also established amphibious composite brigades within its 3 military group armies to bolster its amphibious assault capability. These brigades are part of China's Eastern, Southern, and Central military commands, and would be crucial in supporting Marine Corps operations. The 72nd Group Army, Eastern Theater Command, has 6 brigades, with 2 amphibious composite brigades based in Zhejiang, near Shanghai. The 73rd Group Army also has 6 brigades, with 2 amphibious composite brigades based in Fujian, likely in preparation for an operation against Jingmen. The 74th Group Army, the Southern Theater Command, also has 6 brigades, with 2 amphibious composite brigades stationed in Guangdong, Huizhou. These 6 amphibious composite brigades total approximately 36,000 troops. When combined with 6 Marine Corps brigades, that gives China a force of 12 brigades and roughly 72,000 soldiers available for frontline operations. However, this force would require naval support to transport and land on Taiwan, limiting its combat potential without adequate logistics and air superiority. In terms of naval power, China currently operates 3 aircraft carriers, but they're not yet fully combat ready. In contrast, the U.S. operates 11 aircraft carrier battle groups, which are capable of global strikes and can deploy significant naval power across the world's oceans. While China claims to have the largest fleet in terms of number of ships, the total tonnage and quality of those ships still fall far behind that of the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy, with 3 aircraft carrier battle groups based in Japan and South Korea, has a decisive advantage over China's forces in a potential conflict over Taiwan. China's Navy would mainly rely on amphibious assault ships, destroyers for cover, and submarines to implement a blockade of the Taiwan Strait and prevent any foreign reinforcements from arriving. Recently, U.S. defense experts, including David Axe, have noted that the U.S. Air Force has a relatively simple plan to destroy any Chinese fleet attempting to invade Taiwan. These plans involve the extensive use of anti-ship missiles, a capability that the U.S. has perfected over the years. A military research personnel from a Chinese mainland military scientific research unit specifically analyzed the U.S. military's operational plan. He stated, "This is the U.S. military's operation known as Fast Dragon, which involves dozens of AC-130 transport aircraft and Boeing passenger planes converted into cargo aircraft. From a distance of over 1,000 kilometers from the Taiwan Strait, each plane drops several cargo racks hanging from parachutes, with each rack containing 9 long-range, stealthy anti-ship missiles. These missiles slide off the racks, ignite, and fly toward the Taiwan Strait. The missile attack involves over 1,000 missiles. As these missiles approach the combat zone, they independently detect the distribution of enemy fleets on the sea and air defense capabilities of each ship. The missiles coordinate with each other to bypass the strongest air defense fire and then strike different warships from multiple directions simultaneously. Moreover, the U.S. military's smart, stealthy missiles are designed based on the assumption that all Chinese warships are as advanced as they claim. Even if 100 U.S. advanced Aegis destroyers are crossing the ocean, these 1,000 missiles can still sink them all. On a certain morning, this might be the sequence of events. 10 a.m. The U.S. and Taiwan discover that a massive Chinese fleet of 100 ships has begun crossing the Taiwan Strait. At 10:30, 50 transport aircraft stationed 1,000 kilometers away and on standby drop their missile racks and then turn around to return. At 11:20 a.m., over 1,000 missiles reach the Taiwan Strait. At 11:40 a.m., Taiwanese drones send back spectacular images of blazing fires all over the sea within dozens of kilometers. After lunch, Taiwan's military and most of the U.S. forces stand down from battle readiness and return to their bases, allowing for rest. By nightfall, the sea in the Taiwan Strait is lit up by flames. The next morning, all that remains on the sea are rescue ships from the Chinese and Taiwanese sides. The Taiwan Strait conflict is over. There are 2 versions of the military power gap between the U.S. and China: the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda version and the truth. The CCP's propaganda version. 1. During the Korean War, China's military strength was only a fraction of America's, but the Chinese military managed to win through bravery. 2. The Gulf War awakened the CCP as they realized the military power gap between China and the U.S. was even larger than during the Korean War. So China started to accelerate military modernization. 3. After Xi Jinping took office, military spending increased dramatically, and Chinese military technology advanced rapidly. Today, China's military is said to be close to the U.S. military in strength. 4. Due to the rise of the East and the decline of the West, China's economy and military will vastly surpass that of the U.S. in the future. The reality is, 1. In the Korean War, China's military strength was indeed only a fraction of the U.S. military's. 2. After the Gulf War, China accelerated its military modernization. In terms of sheer numbers, e.g. the number of naval ships, the gap between China and the U.S. shrank. However, because the U.S. military's technological development outpaced China's, the military gap did not shrink. 3. After Xi Jinping came to power, China's military spending increased significantly, and China's military strength surged. The U.S. finally recognized that the Chinese Communist Party considers the U.S. as its deadly enemy, so the U.S. embarked on another round of military expansion, further widening the military gap between the two nations. Perhaps it is the high-ranking Chinese military officials who are well-versed in the true military capabilities of both countries who, after witnessing a preview of the annihilation of the Chinese army, were furious at the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs' public threats. As a result, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs quickly took back its statement, slapping itself and backtracking the very next day.